Hey, thank you so much for coming out on a very dreary day. Probably not a great day for conducting a prescribed burn, but the interest is great, as I can see by the attendance that we have here today. I'm going to first start out with introducing Carol Sullivan, who's with the Galena Arts Center for the Arts, and just have her tell you a little bit about this wonderful facility and the whole operation that she oversees here as the executive director. Carol?
Thank you. It is such a pleasure to have you here this afternoon. The Center for the Arts has been rolling here for about a year since we've opened up our new space, and we have lots of music, we have lots of art. We're so happy to have the art involved with this particular seminar. It's just brilliant and wonderful. So I encourage you, if you take a break or before you leave today, if you want to come back and wander through the galleries upstairs, we have some lovely art up there to look at. This particular subject matter is very important to me because we planted a prairie, a 3-acre prairie, I think in 2008, and it brings me great joy every day that I drive by it. I would love to be able to burn some of the other areas in the woods near our home. I'm terrified I'll burn my house down, so I haven't tried yet. But the concept of being able to do further burns, we used to do lots and lots of burns with the group that used to collaborate on this. I would love to have that happen, and I'm really excited about you doing research on how we can make that happen in our county some more. Anyway, have a really good afternoon here, and I welcome you all.
Thank you, Carol. We're going to be videotaping the session today in hopes of being able to post that on some of the sponsors' websites. So you'll see some videotaping going on because we want to share this with the whole community and the importance of burning, how we can do it safely, and what all is involved. Hopefully we can all learn from what we have to share here today. We have a whole host of people to provide us with information that hopefully will alleviate some of the reasons that we have not burned, much like what Carol just said, because of the fear of fire getting away and having a bad circumstance happen. This event is hosted by 5 non-for-profit organizations. The Galena Center for the Arts has a wonderful facility, and I think that it works perfectly for this setup that we have today. And really like having the ability to have this number of people in a facility with the acoustics and everything that goes with it. We also have the Joe Davis Conservation Foundation, the Woodland Wildlife Cooperative, you'll hear from Brad Petersburg in a few minutes, the University of Illinois Extension, who helped promote the online registration process. Jay Solomon is the conservation coordinator for the region with the U of I Extension, and he'll be running some of the AV equipment and registration and so forth for these events. At this moment, talking about AV things, please remember to silence your phones so we don't have interruptions when we have our speakers. I'm Ken Beach, president of the Northwest Illinois Forestry Association, and welcome all of you to this wonderful seminar symposium today to talk about prescribed fires in our woodlands. We will touch upon prairie burns, but primarily are focusing on woodland burns. We've had an absence of woodland burns in this region for many years. There have been a few little efforts made by JDCF and some of the prairie enthusiasts and so forth, but for the most part, we've seen very little for the last couple hundred years of fires that were pretty typical 200 plus years ago. And it has changed our landscape greatly, and you'll see some of that from the photos and documentation that we have to share today. Because of that absence, this past fall, I don't know if you notice as much as I do, I tend to really pay attention to the woods and what's going on, but it was an excellent fall to show the difference of what the native species when they turn brown and the leaves fall, and then you see this vast amount of green on the forest floor. Those things are things such as honeysuckle, autumn olive, buckthorn, multiflora rose, Japanese barberry, and many other shade-tolerant species that were absent of this area a couple hundred years ago. And it's really changing our forest and how they used to be. Everybody loves to see the oak trees with the sprawling branches that are way out. Those are no longer regenerating in our region because of the shade that's being cast upon our woodlands by these invasive species. Regeneration historically was of the oaks and hickory, and that was our primary, and their regeneration process is basically becoming absent in this region. We'll learn about how prescribed fire will hopefully turn that and give us great benefits to the wildlife, to the regeneration of those oak hickory forests, and reinvigorate our forests back to pre-European settlement days. We have some results. Well, these were our hosts and sponsors. As you can see, there's a number of us that have coordinated together to do this. Our agenda for today is the presentations here for the first hour. We'll have a short break, and then a panel discussion where we'll have panelists up here that we can talk to and interact with and ask our questions. The survey that many of you completed when you did your online registration process talked about woodland owners. You can see 63 of approximately 100 people have a woodland that they have a special interest in. They're an owner of that. We have a number of people here who work in the field of managing woodland and prairie areas. 62% of us are very interested in our natural areas, and another 36% on the art that's being displayed here today. With regard to burns, you can see that about 50% of us have observed or participated in one way or another, prescribed fire. Probably a lot of that prairie, but some of us have been fortunate enough to experience woodland burns, which are quite different, and we'll learn some of those differences today. And then we'll start off by introducing our first speaker. Jillian Moore is originally from the Illinois region, growing up in central Illinois, going to the University of Chicago, received her bachelor's degree in philosophy and fine arts. She then attended the University of Michigan and received her master's degree in conservation ecology in May of 2022. Jillian is very, very busy. When I was going through all of her information, it was really overwhelming. I can't see how possibly she can do all of this, but she is continuing to pursue her master's in fine art from the Leroy E. Hofberger School of Painting in Baltimore, Maryland, all while she is working for the U.S. Forest Service fighting wildfires the past 5 years in Michigan and currently with the interagency Hot Shot crew out of Oregon. She definitely keeps herself very busy, and she finds time to do the painting on top of that, right? Please visit her artwork either today or tomorrow. Her artwork will be on display here tomorrow as well if you don't get a chance to go through it. And I'd like to welcome her to give her a little spiel about all of her experiences on fighting wildfires and why she sees prescribed woodland burns as being a benefit.
Hello everybody, thank you so much Ken for that wonderful introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes? Yep. Awesome. So this is actually the third installment of the art show that is called Carrying the Torch. And it is such an honor for me to be here today and to have it combined with this amazing Woodland Fire Symposium. So I'm very grateful to be speaking to you today. A little summary of sort of what I'm going to be talking to you about. I always like starting these sorts of talks with this particular quotation from Stephen Pine. And Stephen Pine is kind of a very prolific wildfire historian and academic, and what he says is, Earth is a uniquely fire planet, humanity a uniquely fire creature, and the ecology of their interactions is both ancient and profound. So we're just going to be talking about a little slice of that interaction, but I hope at the end of at least the symposium today, if not at the end of my presentation, we get at least a little bit of that sense of the profound. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience and how it kind of built into this project. I'll be talking about some of the artwork in particular and giving a little bit of insight into kind of the making of them and what sort of ecological thought went into them. When I originally did this art exhibition, it was actually part of my master's thesis at the University of Michigan, where I focused on forest and fire ecology. So I have some findings about some qualitative data gathering that I did about the audience of that art exhibit and how it more or less changed their perception of prescribed fire in the Upper Midwest. Of course, at the end, there'll be some time for questions. So Ken already told you a little bit about me and sort of where I come from. I came at this project from 3 different trajectories. So the first of which is as an employee of the United States Forest Service. For the last 5 years I've been fighting fires out west, although we sort of travel around. We actually got to go to Minnesota this last year and fight fire in the Midwest. I started on an engine in Oregon, a little tiny town in central Oregon, before I moved to the hotshot crew in Klamath Falls. I'm actually leaving active firefighting. I'm incumbent as quite ironically, a fire prevention officer in New Mexico, but actually this new position sort of synthesizes my interests in prescribed fire advocacy and public education about fire management in general. As Ken mentioned, I also pursued my master's in conservation ecology, so I'm really interested in the science behind prescribed fire practice and management, and communicating that to the public through art. So I've been a practicing artist for pretty much all of my life, and I'm currently finishing my master's in painting, which is exciting, but potentially maybe not the best career. I just wanted to start with talking about fire in the Western United States. So that was my entry point into an interest in prescribed fire. I learned very quickly just how absolutely fundamentally necessary prescribed fire is for the management of those very flammable western pine forests. And that's not really the subject of our meeting today, but I think I always talk about it because it's where I came from, and I also think it's important to sort of touch on how wildfire in the West really shapes the narrative of fire discussion in this country, even in places here in the Midwest, where we don't really have the risk of catastrophic fire anymore, and yet that sort of news coverage and such really covers the conversation. During that time fighting fire, I was also very sensitive to the fact that people out west are very hesitant about the application of prescribed fire, and for good reason. It's not a mindset that's going to change overnight. This is I always like showing this picture. This is from the Bootleg Fire of 2021 in Oregon. It burned 470,000 acres, that's about 640 square miles. And you can see here, just in terms of forest management in the West, how really good prescribed fire is at mitigating wildfire risk. When I went to Michigan, I kind of came to Michigan with all of these interests in fire management and this real devotion to prescribed fire and its application. And so I started my ecology degree, getting more educated on the actual fire ecology of the Midwest. And what I learned, which, I grew up here and I did all of my high school years in central Illinois, and it took until graduate school for me to realize just how profoundly fire adapted these ecosystems are. And they haven't seen fire, as Ken said, in a couple hundred years, which has had catastrophic, in some cases, catastrophic implications for the ecosystem and its health and its habitat quality, etc. So this project was born. I put together these art pieces and I put together this show. This is the first kind of installation of that show as part of that master's thesis project. And really what I was trying to do was I was trying to find a way to get access to the public and to sort of capture their imagination about prescribed fire and about its application in ways that maybe sort of traditional academic talks or conferences just simply cannot. And I'll talk a little bit more about how effective I think that is at the end this kind of section here. So the show starts out with these depictions of catastrophic wildfire. And I actually think after talking to folks from the first couple of shows that this is still a really important place to start. These were two paintings that I made actually before my first season as a wildland firefighter. These are of the Cranston fire in Southern California that came very close to burning down the town where my family has traditionally been from. And I saw that, and I was finishing my undergraduate degree in philosophy and art of all things. And I thought, man, like look at this carnage, look at what's going down out there. I should probably go and be helpful. This is a piece called Cold Trail. It's actually on that wall back there. You may not be able to see it super well, so it's on the screen as well. And Cold Trail is sort of a material metaphor. When you're firefighting, when you're mopping up, even on a prescribed burn in a woodland, but I'm sure we'll talk about this later, one of the ways that you can sort of safely know that your fire is out is by taking your bare hands, and in some cases crawling on your hands and knees, and feeling for heat. And when you can do that multiple times and you find no heat, you can say with certainty your fire is out. And it's a very time-consuming process, and it's a very detail-oriented process. And in cases in wildfire, sometimes you're doing this around the base of 200-300-year-old trees that have perished in that fire. So it can be a very sort of profound and kind of thought-provoking process as well. So that's what that piece deals with. This is a piece called Shelter, and when the lights come back on, you'll probably be able to see it a little better. This piece is an allegory still talking about fire in the western United States, but now turning the focus on to prescribed fire. So maybe a little piece of firefighter trivia. So when you're a firefighter and you're carrying a pack around, one thing you always take with you is your fire shelter. And this fire shelter, when you're in it, it makes you look kind of like a foil wrapped potato. Because basically what it is it's a thin layer of foil that's laminated to a few layers of nylon with more foil on the inside. And essentially what it does is it tries to mitigate the heat that you would experience were you ever caught in a burnover and reflect that heat back outwards. So I use this as an allegory to talk about what prescribed fire does when you have sort of a catastrophic blaze. What prescribed fire does is it introduces fire, it introduces heat, it burns material, and it creates a kind of shelter. It creates a refuge where when a fire front hits it, the intensity inside of that footprint, and we saw that with that photo I showed you of the bootleg fire, is significantly diminished and survivable. In the original show and kind of throughout, I've always liked to include some actual quotations from the primary literature. So I'm going to do that with you guys today. I'll read you just a slightly longer selection of this really excellent publication by Peter Goulet. And what he says is, models suggest the future will have substantial increases in wildfire occurrence, but prior to recent human-caused fire exclusion, the fire-adapted pine forests of western North America were among the most frequently burned in the world. Restoration of patterns of burning and fuels in forest structure that reasonably emulate historical conditions is consistent with reducing the susceptibility of these ecosystems to catastrophic loss. So why am I talking to you guys about western pine forests and fire out there? Well, what does catastrophic loss to an ecosystem look like here? This place is used to fire profoundly. It's used to fire in an interval at least, so I'm extrapolating here, a lot of my master's research was focused on the upper Midwest in Michigan, but it's equally true here that the fire return interval ranged from 1 to 5 years in terms of prairies, 5 to 10 years in terms of Oak Hickory woodlands, and then encapsulating kind of a range that surrounds that. When you take that away, you change the ecosystem dramatically, but you don't change it dramatically in a way that the public kind of sees and fears. You don't see charred forests and blackened ground. What you see is the prairies diminishing and even disappearing, and you see those Oak Hickory woodlands getting crowded in and changed, and the species that live there fundamentally changing, both plant and animal. So this is a series I call Succession, as in vegetative succession, not the TV show Succession. And this series tells a story about kind of patterns of fire and the effect that they have on a landscape. So if you look at this as a sort of abstract painting, you might not get much from it. If you look at this as a left to right progression a graph or of a map, I think it starts to make a little more sense. So that panel on the left shows a lot of very diverse shapes. That's actually charcoal there. I made these paintings by taking large pieces of paper, like the size of the paintings, and using a drip torch to drip fuel over the paper and sort of seeing where it burns, and then taking those kind of paper fragments and holding them up and arranging them. So you have quite literally the kind of remnants of a burn forming the composition of the painting. So on the left you see there's lots of fire present, and it comes at different intervals, and the way that the colors, the landscape, the vegetation responds to it is very diverse and interesting and very dynamic. About halfway through, in that middle panel, you can see that fire pretty much all but disappears. And that corresponds with the historical development of settling in the Midwest and of sort of colonization that also included a very strict regime of fire suppression. And you can see that deep, green, wooded, flowing area that's representing these changes to an ecosystem where fire-adapted species like prairie grasses and oaks are being replaced by these shade-tolerant, damp-loving species, and some of them might be native, like red maple. They're not invasive, but some of them are invasive. And the only way to control them is by bringing back the disturbance factor that would make them leave and sort of allow the native fire-adapted species to start regenerating. On the left side there, far, far, far at the end, you can start to see some small fires popping back up. And that's a tribute in these paintings to the reintroduction of prescribed fire in the last couple decades. And the one thing I always like to point out in these paintings that I was trying to be attentive to as sort of an artist putting them together is if you notice the aftermath of those little fires, how sort of green and yellow and still kind of cool it is. It takes a long time to build a fire regime back. And once you do one prescribed burn in, say, a densely wooded area with a lot of invasive honeysuckle or a lot of invasive autumn olive, it's not going to look the same as after a prescribed burn or even an anthropogenic fire 200 years ago. It takes a long time to build that pattern back. And I think this quotation does a really good job of highlighting that, and I'll just read, again, just a little bit. Plant communities are undergoing a rapid compositional and structural change, some with no ecological antecedent. Stand-level species richness is declining and will decline further as numerous fire-adapted plants are replaced by a limited set of shade-tolerant, fire-sensitive species. As this process continues, the effort and cost required to restore fire-adapted ecosystems escalates rapidly. One thing that astounded me, just as kind of a sidebar about this piece, and again, this is more about prairie ecosystems than it is necessarily about oak woodlands, is that at least in Michigan, there's a whole peninsula of prairie that kind of extended up into, everybody does this, right? Into this part of Michigan. Less than 0.1% of those prairies and oak savannas remain. There used to be 2.23 million acres, less than 0.1 remain. So think about change on that scale applied to a landscape like this one. We haven't seen fire here, broad scale, in 200 years. Think of how much change that has enacted upon this landscape. So this is a collage, you guys probably saw outside, and these are made out of retired Forest Service prevention signs. So quick question, who here has heard of Smokey Bear? Raise your hand. Say it with me, only you can prevent forest fires. That's not very nuanced messaging, is it? Not really. Sort of funny. Part of my new role as a fire prevention officer is to hang these signs up. But I think it's actually worth noting today. I'm here with my artist hat on. I'm not here with my Forest Service hat on. My opinions do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. government. Although they do, for the record, significantly overlap, most likely. So this was kind of a fun project. I took these signs and I'm like, okay, Smokey Bear tells us one thing. He's told us that one thing for a very long time, and he's told us that thing for a very long time very effectively. Every school child knows who Smokey Bear is. But maybe wildfire is good business for a healthy environment. So this project was sort of tongue-in-cheek. I was taking these signs, I was cutting them up, I was rearranging them, and I was trying to sort of draw attention to how absurd this one-line message is about wildfire and fire management. Yes, of course we need to be careful in fire-prone places and not start new fires where they can take off, but we also need to sort of talk to the public in a way where they're informed about fire's integral role in the ecology of many fire-adapted places. So I always tongue-in-cheek think of this project as kind of a preventing Smokey Bear. This is the last quotation that I'm actually going to read to you guys. This one astounded me when I first read it in Michigan. And again, this is about Michigan, but I promise you that this sentiment was here in Illinois as well. And this is from a fairly pedestrian handbook that the Michigan Department of Conservation published annually in 1950. And it says, prior to organized protection, the number of forest fires in Michigan averaged well over 3,000 a year, the annual burn over 500,000 acres, and the resulting damage to more than $1.5 million a year, without taking into account the enormous economic loss resulting from millions of acres of unproductive land. So they're talking about timber. Since 1930, the number of fires has been reduced by half, the area burned annually to less than 0.2% of the area protected. Here we go with the rhetoric. The record is one of which to be proud, but that does not mean that the fire problem has been licked, or that further effort is unnecessary. The threat remains, and only by eternal vigilance can forest fires be kept under control. Every fire is a menace, and only by prompt and effective control can disastrous conflagrations be avoided. That was the predominant theory of fire management as of 1950. What that doesn't take into account is to get places like that, or oak and clear woodlands like we see here less and less. You have to do a bit of that. This was a piece that was present in the original show. I actually had to take a saw and cut it apart to get it out the door of that gallery. So here we have part 2. This lovely installation is largely due to the efforts of our organizer, Brad. So kudos to him, and if you really like this, talk to him about it because it's his masterpiece. And this piece was called Carrying the Torch. It was the title piece of the show. And I think it's probably the most pertinent one to the topic of today's conversation, namely woodland burning. So that's a piece of red oak right there. You can maybe tell by the leaves. And behind it is this sort of encroaching stand of invasive honeysuckle and, native but opportunistic red maple that take over when fire is absent. And what this piece is maybe suggesting is that the oak itself is a carrier of the torch. It's a carrier of fire. And when you think about it, a lot of species that are fire adapted actually do propagate fire. So in the case of oak, and this is something that when we conduct prescribed burns, we actually have to be mindful and sort of not worried, but like you have to take into consideration that the oak leaves really want to burn. The oak has evolved to make fire part of its life cycle. So those leaves, unlike maple leaves, which are very wet and very flat and they compact very close to the ground, they don't burn very well. It's very hard to conduct a prescribed burn in a maple stand. But the oak leaves really want to burn. The oak trees really need that disturbance so their seedlings have enough light to propagate. So oaks are, in their own way, kind of carriers of torches themselves. In the children's book outside, it's kind of a simplified children's narrative told partially from the perspective of one of these like, beautiful wide crown oak trees that are, we just don't see any more of those. So I encourage you to take a look at that. One thing I wanted to mention when I was putting the children's book together is that a lot of the fires in this part of the world, fires don't start easily here naturally. We don't get a lot of lightning, certainly not as much as we do out west. And then the field beds are much less receptive to fire and they won't carry it as far. So a lot of the burning that started off these ecosystem dynamics was anthropogenic. It was done by Native American tribes. So in Michigan at least, the folks who were responsible for that long, sort of rich dynamic of prescribed fire were the keepers of the 3 fires. Okay, some findings from the first instantiation of the exhibit. I won't talk too much about this. This is more of a sort of meta-commentary on the value of the sort of thing that we're doing today. So on the value of taking art and taking scientific information and taking practical information and delivering it to the public with the hopes of not just informing but inspiring. The numbers are really small here. I don't really want you to look at the numbers, but basically what my study looked at was how did an experience like this modify people's ecological understanding, their support for the application of prescribed fire, and their concern about the ecological effects of fire exclusion. And what you can see here, if you just look at the distributions of people and their responses, they start out pretty even, and then by the end, like everybody is more or less clumped in a higher category of understanding, support, or concern. And this is just sort of a general summary of that. You can see each category increased with concern increasing the most. And I think just generally speaking, there is a dearth of concern about fire exclusion just in the general public. The management community is very attuned to the problems of fire exclusion, but I think the public certainly is not. So that's one thing that will really drive sort of our ability, just very generally speaking, to get fire on the landscape is, you know, how many people care about it and how many people are willing to both tolerate it and then also advocate for its use. I put this up here towards the poetics of fire just because I think it's important always to take a step back and think about how our relationship with fire as a species has sort of modified the environment that we live in. So we are the keystone species of the fire environment. From the very first time that we started walking this planet, we sort of did so with fire in our pocket. We both changed the way that fire itself was applied to the land, and we also changed the land so that fire could, you know, interact with it in different ways. So one of the things that we kind of are here, living in the Midwest, living in Joe Daviess County, is we are folks who maybe aren't able to carry out kind of the responsibility that was etched out for us by people who lived here for thousands and thousands of years, which is as starters and kind of perpetuators of fire on the landscape. Maybe that's getting too far into the ether, but I do sort of like to cap it with that. And the last thing I'll say is, you know, I try to keep that in mind throughout my entire art practice. These are some more recent pieces. Again, more talking about kind of my experiences out west fighting fire there. But one thing I try to never lose track of is it's really not good to think of fire as a binary. You know, fire is both productive and destructive, but even when we're talking about fire risk in the West, excuse me, we always have to think about it also in terms of a absolutely essential ecological agent. So at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions. My contact information is there, so if anybody wants to reach out to me, please feel like you can do that. And that QR code will link you to my website where you can see the whole catalog of the show and get access to some of the primary literature that I quoted briefly. So thank you so much.
Any questions for Jillian before she takes a seat? She will be on our panel this afternoon, and you'll have an opportunity to ask there after you think about it and hear the other presentations as well. Anyone? Hey, thank you. Very exciting. I think I learned a lot. I'm assuming everybody here learned a lot. Just different perspectives and the different thought processes that we all have leads us to different conclusions, and very informative. Thank you again. Our next presenter is Steve Barb. He's the Executive Director of the Joe Daviess Conservation Foundation. Steve's been very involved with the NISC, Northern Illinois Stewardship Cooperative, a group that works for the organization to help in managing a lot of our lands here in Joe Daviess County. So he is going to talk about forest fires and prairie restoration work that the NISC team does. NISC is 6 to 10 people strong. It's pretty much the only organized group in this part of the state that's doing prescribed burns. And they have some really neat historical information to share with you. We also have a video that the NISC team did on a burn that will be shown, I think, by Brad. And so there's some real interesting things that are happening here locally, just to bring this all back home here a little bit for us. So, Steve, why don't you take the floor here and tell us the story of ADCF and their process of prescribed burning.
Thank you, Ken. And Jillian, thank you for that thought-provoking presentation. I'm going to try and build off of what Jillian was bringing together, which was the science of fire and the culture of fire, the human culture and the ecological culture of fire, and bring it home here, like Ken said. So, I'm going to start with a little local history. When you drove in to this center, either on your right if you were coming from the west, or on your left if you were coming from the east, what's across the street here? Yeah. Does anyone know the history of that cemetery? What it's called? I think it's called Greenwood Cemetery. Pretty sure it's the largest cemetery in Joe Davis County, certainly in Galena. And it's outsized. It's a huge cemetery for such a small village. It just seems kind of weird. There's a lot of cemeteries around here. So why is it so big? Galena's 2,500 people now. Galena was the largest city in Illinois in the mid-1800s, and somewhere around 17,000 people were living in Galena. So I want you to hold on to that for just a second as we look at these slides, and I think this will make a little more sense. So we're looking at a cemetery here. We're also looking at a Joe Davis Conservation Foundation preserve that's 316 acres long, 316 acres. In the bottom corner, that's the Mississippi River. Ferry Landing Road is the road that runs diagonal on the boundary. So it takes you down to Ferry Landing. I'm trying to give you just kind of where this is on the landscape. And at the bottom of the screen, you can see a bunch of green circles and purple circles, and then you can see on the other side some linear green and purple kind of oval shape. Those represent burial mounds. So there are about 40 burial mounds on this site. It's a historic cemetery of the Sauk people, Sac and Fox, and the Ho-Chunk people and their ancestors. And so we preserve this site primarily because of its cultural value, Native American cultural value, but it also has a beautiful oak woodland at the bottom of it. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. So if you look along the Mississippi River, north and south, here in Joe Davis County, you see a lot of these places. Casper Bluff, some of you may have been to, that's another large cemetery, indigenous cemetery. If you go just north of here to where the Sinsinawa River comes in, there's a whole set of other mounds. You go up to Gramercy Park in East Dubuque, another set of Indian burial mounds. They are just literally scattered all along the bluffs here. So what does that tell us about how populated this area was? It was very populated over a long period of time, and that's sort of counterintuitive to what I learned growing up, that the United States, when Europeans landed, was largely a pristine wilderness. Pristine meaning there weren't humans on it. It was all native. It was all natural. There weren't any people on it, or very few. And we now have learned that that just is not correct. That's untrue. There were millions of people living on this landscape, indigenous people. And as Jillian was saying, they used fire regularly for agriculture, for game, to attract or drive game, to clear areas where they wanted to settle. and to regenerate these ecological processes that kept their ecosystems rich with plants and animals. So remember that. Now we're going to go back. Jillian was saying 200 years ago, fire ceased in that area. So we're going to go back 100 years ago. This is a 1927 aerial of the southern end of this preserve. I'm sorry, we're going to take this look at the southern end, and then we're going to look at it. So this is 2021 when this map was generated. Here it is in 1927, almost 100 years earlier. And I'm going to go back and forth on this because I want you to look at the density of the forest. Which one has more openings? Which one has less tree cover? So the cessation of fire, and this is 100 years after fires were ceased by indigenous people. You can see a difference in the next 100 years in terms of how that looks on the landscape. There's a few other photos we have, historic photos. Here's what these mounds look like, how big they are. And these are taken earlier than 1927, so here's a ground level view of how open this area was. If we stood on the same mound today, we'd be surrounded by trees. It would be very shady. Here's another view of that. So, Jillian and Ken and others were talking about how JDCF and NISC, one of the things we're doing is reintroducing that fire, reintroducing this disturbance that's so important to keep these woods and prairies that we live in healthy. And one of the things we're doing, so I want you to just take a look. Everybody's wearing Nomex suits. They don't have helmets on yet, but they're about to put on helmets. I want you to see the gear behind them. They've got a few trucks and UTVs full of water and drip torches, things to start fires, put fires out with. There's a lot that goes into this from thinking, from a safety standpoint, trying to figure out what our goals of the fire are. There's a lot of planning, a lot of training, and a lot of logistics that go on to keep this a safe activity for the people conducting it and to make sure it doesn't escape from the prescribed area where we want the fire. Everyone standing there, with the exception of Jake in the background, Jake was supposed to give this presentation, but he couldn't make it today, are indigenous primarily Sauk people. One of them is absentee Shawnee. So we've been working with Sac and Fox Tribe of Oklahoma, bringing them back to their ancestral homelands, which we all live on. If you live in this part of the country, in northwest Illinois or southwest Wisconsin, you're living on Sauk ground, you're living on Ho-Chunk ancestral ground. And some of their people are also using fire again in Oklahoma. They prefer to be doing fire here on their homeland. They long to be back on their homeland, at least these guys do. And so for the first time in 200 years, we had indigenous people lighting fire to their ancestral home grounds. This is just in November of this year. It was a pretty remarkable thing to be a part of and to witness the joy and the importance of these men, all clan leaders, laying fire on their ancestral home ground 200 years later. And here's what that looked like. I think I can do this. There we go. Indigenous people laying fire in a sacred woodland around burial mounds of their ancestors. Immediately post-burn, not quite ready to walk around on your hands and knees yet, Jillian, but getting there. One of the ancient oaks, all the other trees you're seeing are there because of the cessation of fire. All right. What did we learn from this? We learned that we're torch carriers. We're carrying the torch that started a long, long, long time ago. This was a profound change for our own burn crew to think about what they're doing on the land. That they're carrying on a tradition that has been a tradition for thousands of years on this landscape. It was stopped for 200 years. We're restarting that tradition in the woods. So we don't often get a chance to burn with our indigenous partners, but now every time they're going out to conduct burns, they have a whole new appreciation and perspective of the importance of what they're doing and the carrying on of a tradition that humans have been doing, as Jillian was talking about, for thousands of years. This interaction of people and fire and ecosystems. It's a really rich complex. This is Sam Spang and Tommy Calendrone, two tribal clan leaders, just, I don't know, in awe of this experience for them on the landscape. All right, I think with that, I'll be around for questions in the panel as well. I'll be talking more about NISC in the panel. I'm glad, Jillian, you set up that piece so well, and we were able to bring it home to what we're doing here in Joe Davis County. And I think, Brad, you're up next, is that right? Or Jen and then Brad? Yep. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Steve. I do want a quick mention, when Steve was going through his presentation there, I've had the opportunity to work with NISC on a half a dozen burns or so, and their incredible ability to put a burn plan together, have a pre-burn meeting, and the safety that goes into making sure that we contain that fire. Fire, there is a risk. We can't eliminate and have no risk, but we sure can control it and really minimize that risk greatly, and they do an excellent job. They've been involved in burns for 35 years, and they are top-notch and do a wonderful job with that. Thank you. Our next speaker is Brad Petersburg. He's the one that came up with this idea for today and approached me and several others and helped in putting together this wonderful session to share with us all of these experiences and help educate the public on what prescribed burns and fire do for us and how they can be done safely and the benefits that come across from them. Brad leads a group here in the Driftless area called the Woodland Wildlife Cooperative, and these local landowner folks have come together to kind of start this cooperative to try and improve the habitat for our wildlife in the area. Brad?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jillian and Steve. I'm not a great presenter, so it's tough following these guys, but I did want to say a few words. I and some neighbors formed the Woodland Wildlife Cooperative a few years ago, and it's it's an informal organization. It's just neighbors working together to try to improve wildlife habitat in our woodland. There's no formal organization, nothing like that. So, and I'm not really going to speak much about the cooperative. If you're interested, contact me. Be happy to put you on the mailing list. Really, one of the main purpose of the meeting today is to talk more about why we want to burn, why we want to get more fire on the landscape, not spend so much time on describing exactly how you do it, but why do we do it? And for me personally, I just love oak trees. I've always loved oak trees. This is one down near Hanover that I kind of fell in love with. It was about 10 years ago. I was thinking about buying this property and we ended up buying another one. But anyway, this massive white oak, it's got, you can see these wide outstretched limbs. It's, I believe it was over 110 feet, you know, the canopy wide. Those limbs, you can see a friend of mine is standing there next to the tree. Those massive side limbs, to me they just look like big arms out there. So I had to call it mighty oak. It always makes me think of a mighty oak. But it isn't just the aesthetics, as I'm now finally learning more and more about managing woodlands, how important these oak trees are for wildlife. And you know, most of us initially think of acorns for deer, turkey, you know, birds of all sorts, all kinds of creatures. But beyond that, equally important, they host, from what I've read, multiple sources, over 500 species of insects, which maybe you wonder, well, why is that important? Well, that's kind of the bottom of the food chain, you know, that's where it all starts. Birds and everything else eat those. They need that protein source. And so anyway, it's more than just aesthetics, it's the benefit for wildlife. And this particular oak, if you look at the background, you see how dense that canopy is, that kind of jungle in the background. That actually is what it looked like around that tree until about 10 years ago. Even though I don't own it, I know the owner pretty well. Every couple of years I go and mow underneath it. I cleaned it all out. I wanted to give it a little bit more life again, you know, give it a little break. But here's the bad news. That limb on me, this right about here, about 2 years ago, that limb cracked off, or didn't totally off, but it's resting on the ground. And you landowners out there, you forest owners, you know we're losing these big old massive oaks. I see it in my woodland and I know you see it in yours too. And if we don't give these young oak trees with some more sunlight, we're never going to see any more of these big old open grown oak trees out in our woods. They, you know, all we'll have is straight poles reaching for the sunlight. Which isn't a bad thing if you want to focus on timber production, and we need timber, I understand that. But anyway, I'm here to kind of encourage giving the oaks a break and helping to restore some native habitat. So how am I doing that? This is a map of my property. The red line is the perimeter, and I call it an oak oasis that I'm creating, an oasis for wildlife. So I picked out these areas just because there's some healthy oaks here, some young ones trying to make it, but you can clearly see that, you know, if you're out there, they need more sunlight. They're not thriving by any means. So those are the areas that I'm going to focus on. So I would encourage you as landowners, you know, to think about the same thing. I mean, where do you start? You can't do everything at once. You got to start somewhere. So maybe just, you know, work with your forester if you need some help. Identify an area that got a number of young oaks that are doing well, but they need some more help. Start small. Start somewhere anyway, and make that little oasis for wildlife. Part of maintaining that oasis, once you get it once you thin out that woodland and give the oaks some more sunlight, is prescribed fire. So the east, kind of northeast half of my property outlined in red there, we had a prescribed burn just last spring. The NIST group that's with JDCF, they helped lead that. We started, I'm going to show a little video, because we've got some drone video there in just a second. But we started up in the far northeast corner, in the upper side of this picture. Split up into two crews. One goes kind of counterclockwise with the flame, and the other goes clockwise, and we end up meeting at the lower left corner down near the pond. So just kind of for reference, when you see some of the video, remember the pond is way down on the south end of my property. Driveway down there, and there's a little silt pond just above the main pond, and then way up on the north end, there's that little grass field. You'll see that when the video starts here in just a second. Ken mentioned this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is just the team getting set before the start of the burn. The burn boss, Jake Pulper, he goes into great detail reviewing the burn plan and weather conditions, ground conditions, all kinds of safety issues. All of that is really important before you conduct a prescribed burn. Obviously, get all the equipment ready. Get some signage out on the road if you potentially, might be bringing smoke across the road. This happened to be a field day we held for the Woodland Wildlife Cooperative, invited some people. So that's Jake with the NIST organization. He's the burn boss, and he was handing out copies of the burn plan and explaining what we were going to do that day and the safety measures that were being taken, etc. And then we got started. I don't have any aerial video of the start of the fire. This happened to be a couple still shots. And again, one on the right is one of the crews that was headed towards the west, going, let's see, I guess that would be kind of counterclockwise on that burn unit, and the other went south down the road going clockwise. But you can see, I remember seeing part of Steve's presentation. You had some pretty good wind that day. Those flames were raging pretty high that day. You typically don't see that much flame in a woodland burn. Depends on the conditions, slope, the dryness of the leaf litter, etc., everything else, a lot of different factors. Often it's a much smaller flame, something like this. And then we get into the video, and I might pause this in just a couple places. But this is the field up in the northwest corner where we first got started with the burn. You can see the burn crew has gone down south along the road. I'm going to pause it for just a second. So that burn line is extended quite a ways down the road. You can see the smoke is rising and dissipating, and that's part of the whole planning process as well, picking the right weather so you don't, smoke out the neighbors. You want conditions where that smoke rises. And I'll hit play again. Here we're at, well, maybe I better advance it just a little bit farther. You can see they're starting, you can see in the upper portion there's that burned grass field up in the northern part of the property. The second burn crew that's going clockwise is following the trail over here, and they're now going to be headed downhill. You can see little yellow uniforms there where the burn crew is headed down the hill down towards the ravine. And by the way, before I forget it, I need to thank Beth Baranski for helping me so much on editing all this video. We spent hours working on that, and thank you very much. Plus, she introduced me, when we were first planning this, to Jillian. I didn't know anything about Jillian, and so what a wonderful connection there. Thank you, Beth, so much. Again, the smoke is rising and dissipating. You can kind of see now that ravine where this view is from the north looking south. You can see that ravine and crew that is going down towards the ravine. They'll more or less follow that ravine towards the south end of the property. There you can see the ponds in the background where they're headed down that direction. Fair amount of smoke there, but it is all rising and dissipating, which is a good thing. And now we're just kind of switching gears. This is looking towards the north and kind of backing down that ravine. You can see they've extended that fire line quite a ways down the ravine. They'll be just about to the silt pond. They'll show that one of the next. Oh, I guess we're jumping here to the. Take a quick look at the south end of the property. So there's my main pond. There's my driveway. The burn crew on the landing road has made it almost all the way down to the driveway. They'll be coming in the driveway and turning the corner, and then they'll pause and wait for the other group to catch up. There's the silt pond. It's just above the main pond, so that burn line is extended as far as the burn pond. We're just going to loop that entire property. There's also some interior burning taking place at the same time because there's so many trails there. It kind of breaks it up. We needed to add some interior burning. That kind of dark patch there, there is an area that's been opened up significantly, and that's more kind of open prairie conditions than woodland, so that burned very well, very well. Some of the areas didn't burn as well, but that's all right. If I pause for just a second there, you can see the burn crew that started on the road. They came in the driveway and they came down to the kind of the southwest corner of the property. That other line, you can see the burn line. They're almost. The guy with the drip parts is right here. He's almost to the finish line where we'll have encircled the entire property. So that's what a woodland burn looks like. It's about, this was about 50 acres. On the south edge there where you see the UTV, there's a patch of grass there, so that burns a little more vigorously. You get a little bit more flame. That flame moves a little faster if you're familiar with prairie burns. This is kind of a sort of a closing scene. I'm going to pause it again for just a second and just point out the flame height you see here is typically what we had throughout the woodland burn. Most of it, you're just burning the leaf litter, so that flame doesn't get real high in most areas, that it doesn't move all that fast. And we've made that whole loop, but again, there's going to be some interior burn continuing for hours, and in some cases there might be certain little pockets of some brush piles that might burn for a couple of days. This is kind of circling back to the south end to see what it looks like after most of the burn is complete, but it's still burning, it's still extending into the woodland. It doesn't entirely burn in this area, but most of that area gets burned. And this was just kind of thrown in for comparison. I decided to burn the cattails along my pond there, so that's more like prairie conditions where you've got a lot of fuel and you get a big flame, so you can see what that looks like by comparison. Get some pretty high-flying flames there. Anyway, that is what a woodland barn looks like, at least it did on my place last April. And there's the burn crew, we gathered at the end and took a photo, had a big team there, plenty of people, which is great. This is what it looked like the next day. You can see the trails that have been mowed, there's not enough fuel there, so it really doesn't tend to burn across those trails typically. Another shot that following day, you can see there's some patches that are unburned there, that maybe there just wasn't enough oak or hickory leaf litter, or maybe there's a little more damp in that area, but that's all right. That leaves a little shelter for little critters to get away, and it's just good to have a mosaic, have diversity out there anyway. And maybe more importantly, this is what it looked like a month later. As I was wandering around to take a look, there's a lot of honeysuckle you can see standing in the background. It looks like just dead sticks there. They would have been all leafed out and green as could be if it wasn't for that fire. I can't say that all of them have been killed dead. Some of them might just be stunted, set back, but it really does have an impact on that honeysuckle. And kind of right in the middle of the picture, I just about tripped over a fawn. So, cute little guy there. So apparently wildlife has evolved over time to adapt to fire pretty well, kind of like oak trees. They're fine with it all. So, with that, I'm going to turn it back to Ken, and he's going to give us some instructions on the break.